So welcome to the South Asia lecture series called Imagining the Environment. This lecture series is a part of a longer series that we've started since the start of spring this year. In the spring, we ran a series called Perceptions of Environment, where we've had a number of graduate, student, and early career who have presented several drafts of their paper. So imagining the environment actually draws on, but also extends the debate further into specific case study of India. It is started with an intention to include or foster space where we can bring academics, journalists, and activists in order to talk about this emergent crisis of climate change. The series was started in August and it would lead up to the end of October. And it ends with a book discussion by Camelia Divan. And the book is titled Misreading the Delta. So please look up for her presentation towards the end of this series. This talk will go about for 50 minutes. So Lyla would speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we would have about 20 minutes for discussion. And to introduce Lyla, Professor Lyla Mehta is a professor at Institute of Development Studies. She's trained as a sociologist at the University of Vienna, and then has had her PhD in development studies from University of Sussex. Her work focuses on water, sanitation, forced displacement and resistance, climate change, scarcity, rights and access, resource grabbing, and politics of environment and development. Her current project focuses on climate change, uncertainty, transformation in marginal environment, and off-grid sanitation in urban area. She has done extensive fieldwork in India studying politics of water scarcity, the linkages between gender displacement and resistance, access to water, sanitation in peri-urban areas, and climate change. Additionally, she's also worked on politics of water management in Southern Africa and community-led total sanitation. Lyla has engaged in advisory with various United Nations agencies and has also been active in advocacy and activist work on gender, environment, and displacement. She was the water and sanitation convener for STEP Center and is currently the editor for the Journal of Environment and Planning Nature and Space. But my personal entry in interest to Lyla's work has been since my early on MA and MPhil days, where I was introduced to a body of work that Lyla had produced, and perhaps one of the first on development that displaces women in particular. So I'm very thrilled and excited and humble that Lyla has kindly accepted the request to speak in the series. Before she would begin, there are two ways to ask question. One is to write your question into the chat box, and I'll have the question read at the end. Since Lyla is also the co-host, she would have the access to your question, but nonetheless, I will have it read for you. Other way to ask is just raise your hand, and I'll have you unmute and you can ask your question yourself. So welcome, Lyla.
Hi, everybody. Rahul, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction and also for this invitation. This has been a terrific series, and it's really an honor to be part of it. There's been great talks, and I look forward to listening to those that I've missed so far, and I participated in a few. And I look forward to some of the future ones, including Camelia's book launch, of course. So congratulations, Camelia, again. It's nice to see you all here. And just one caveat before I start. I'm in India right now. It's been absolutely wonderful to be here after 19 months, but my internet's really bad for the last few days. So please bear with me, and I hope there won't be any problems. I've emailed my PowerPoint to you, Rahul. If you could email it to Shilpi, maybe she can just jump in. Or even Swati, who can talk a little about her work. So I just hope it'll be fine. Anyway, so let me just start now. Sorry, no, this is just a minute. I don't know what's happened. Just give me a minute. I thought I had everything ready. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, yeah, can.
Okay, so as Rahul said, I'm going to talk about my current project, which is a collaborative project with lots of amazing people. This project is Transformations as Praxis in Marginal Environments, Reframing Nature's Knowledges and Livelihoods. That's the topic I'm going to talk about today, but the project is Transformation as Praxis, Exploring Socially Just and Transdisciplinary Pathways to Sustainability in Marginal Environments. This is the Tapestry project. And I'm talking on behalf of lots of colleagues. You can see the logos up there. This is a project that is funded by multiple donors, and their logos are up there, the Belmont, North Face, EU, and several research councils. And we're working across 4 countries, the UK, where I'm the PI of the overall project, then Norway, where Sinamovic is PI, then Nobu Onte in Kyoto University, and here in India in Bombay, Parthasati, Dr. Parthasati from IIT Bombay. And one of my, the co-Is and is Shilpi Srivastav is also here. So I hope she'll jump in. And it's been a really exciting project, but of course, like all projects, this is how we've had to work for over a year and a half. So we actually haven't met for 2 years. And so what I present now is based on what we've done digitally, a little field work we've managed to do. And as I said, it's a joint collaboration across. And I'll also highlight the names of people when I come to their relevant pieces of work. After about 2 years, I had 2 days in Varsova, Kolivada yesterday and last week. So it was really exhilarating to actually be able to go back to the field and meet some colleagues here in Bombay, where I am now. So to give you a little background, the focus is on uncertainty, climate change, and transformation. And as all of you know, the impacts and knowledges of climate change are characterized by uncertainty, especially as we downscale, as we go to the local level. And our starting point is that uncertainty and climate change are usually characterized from above. We draw on experts modeling, on knowledges, and assessments from above. But these are often not attuned with local people's own understandings of climate change and also uncertainty. And there are also limits to mainstream adaptation. And in fact, a sort of managerialist attitude or a controlling attitude towards uncertainty can increase the vulnerabilities of marginal people. So our overarching questions are, how attuned are a lot of these global or national portrayals, including the INDCs, with how local people live with, understand, and adapt to climate change and uncertainty. And our starting point is that while uncertainty can cause anxieties for vulnerable people, can it also be an opportunity for transformation? Now, obviously, climate change interacts with all sorts of other drivers of change, uneven impacts of capitalist expansion, for example, socio-political trajectory. So local people understand climate change mediated through all these different lenses. And all these uneven impacts are threatening people's well-being and sense of place and identity. And these can also exacerbate the vulnerabilities of climate change. Now, climate-related uncertainty for us in the project refers to the inability to predict the scale, intensity, and impact of climate change on human and natural environments. And we look at uncertainty in terms of, it's a situation where we don't know what we don't know, and it's, where one doesn't know the odds and the probabilities cannot be calculated. And it can be epistemic, so the realm of knowledge, aleatoric, that's the sort of uncertainty in the inherent variability in natural systems, and also linked to broader political economy conditions. So now, what is transformation? As we know, it's a widely used concept in climate change debates in recent years. And usually it refers to radical shifts, non-linear, and also break with the development to status quo. So we're really looking at going beyond incremental adaptation or transition and calling instead for deep-seated and structural change. So as spelling says, it's an opportunity to reconfigure the meaning and trajectory of development. So we follow Few et al. In distinguishing between transformational adaptation, which tends to address immediate causes of vulnerability, from sort of transformative adaptation, which is an opportunity to address structural causes and root causes. So this also means questioning dominant economic, historical, and developmental discourses that require the sort of reconfiguration of knowledge as well as value systems. So obviously transformation is very diverse. It means different things to different people. It's unruly, and it means challenging incumbent structures and power relations. So it's very contested. It's a normative project, but of course, like everything, it can be vague, it's a buzzword, it can be open-ended and also used in all sorts of ways, problematic ways. So obviously this project is taking a very critical lens in understanding what transformation is. We are a part of the Transformations to Sustainability program by all the donors I highlighted, but this is sort of how we're addressing it. So critical to questions of transformation are issues of well-being, identity, agency, and how they link to livelihoods. And as we know, climate change affects well-being and people's sense of place and social identity. And I'll highlight that in the cases. And agency is central to understanding environmental change and crisis. So what we're interested in doing is co-producing socio-ecological knowledges and change that can enhance agency as well as transform socio-political structures. So let me give you some examples that I'll pick up later. So in Kutch, for example, we're looking at the relationship between camels and mangroves and how these are linked to pastoralist identity. In the Sundarbans, it's the relationship with the forest. And all these environments are so-called marginal environments that are characterized by natural events such as floods, droughts, cyclones. And they're also stereotyped. So for example, Kutch, where we're studying, is considered to be remote, both Kutch and the Sundarbans. Wastelands, drylands are considered to be unproductive. Or you also have this notion of mangroves, which are really critical for survival on the coast for all kinds of coastal dwellers, as well as fish and other more than human environments. It's kind of considered to be on the edge. So by drawing on historical research, we're looking at contrast between the marginal and the normal and how these have shaped administrative interventions and state capacities, but also created sociological and economic distinctions. So thus for us in Tapestry, we're very interested in reimagining these marginal environments and also what constitutes the marginal. So we're looking, for example, at how pastoralist groups and activists are reframing the drylands from being considered wastelands, to productive spaces or savanna type of landscapes that successfully sustain a whole range of livelihoods and lifestyles. And similarly in Bombay, we're looking at the city's edge and how to reimagine it and move away from the traditional ways of looking at it. So I'll point some of these issues out in a little while. So key to our approach is the concept of praxis and patches. So as I said, we're looking at bottom-up transformation in these marginal environments. We're challenging this top-down valuation. And for us, these patches are sites where relations of power and knowledge are reconfigured and where alternative practices of development are emerging. So we're looking at these alliances between different hybrid actors, so local communities, scientists, NGOs, and that's the kind of co-production that we're looking at. And each patch is unique, some fade, some grow or merge to form a tapestry. And the underlying assumption is that, to tackle some of these wider changes that all these patches are facing, these incremental approaches, such as mainstream adaptation, are insufficient. And that's why you really need these systemic bottom-up processes of change. So which are the patches that we're looking at? As I've already alluded, we are looking at three different landscapes. We're looking at dryland Kutch, where I've spent a lot of time. My PhD was based in dryland Kutch, and I've been going back a long time. But we're looking at work along the coast, where rapid industrial expansion has led to the undermining of the commons and coastal ecosystems. And here, NGOs, scientists are working with local villagers to revive indigenous breeds and also improve lifestyles and also experiment with different forms of sustaining life and livelihoods in the drylands. Then we're looking at vulnerable coastal areas of Mumbai, where citizens, NGOs, and state agencies are reimagining urban planning and resisting some of these coastal commercial developments that are threatening the livelihoods of the original dwellers of the city, the Kohli fishing community, and also looking at restoring the creek and the mangroves. And finally, the delta, the Sundarbans Delta across India and Bangladesh, which is a climate hotspot. And we're taking a transboundary lens to it and also looking at how to revive livelihoods in the face of increasing climatic shocks and stresses. For example, a whole series of cyclones. So our approach basically, so why are we saying transformation as praxis? We see praxis as a reflexive process involving a critique of existing social arrangements as well as the search for alternatives. And the focus here is very much on agency and bottom-up processes of change. And critical are these transformative alliances that I've mentioned, a whole sort of hybrid actors coming together where you can actually see multiple and bring multiple perspectives and lenses and work in a transdisciplinary as well as an interdisciplinary manner. And that also means learning and unlearning. So this kind of transgressive learning a la Lot's Sitsika. And finally, what is the potential once we learn to scale up and out? And what are the tensions in the process? So what are the trade-offs? What are the tensions? So in terms of our methodological approach, as I said, in all these patches, we're building on long durée perspectives. Many of us have been working there for a long, long time, and we're working with locally based partners. Of course, in the pandemic, it's been difficult to build on an ethnographic approach and in-depth fieldwork, but that's ideally what we would have wanted to do. And hopefully we can do some of it for the next year. We've been also experimenting with digital work and visual approaches, which I'll talk about. A lot of it, archival research has been really critical, especially to look historically about the reframing of these landscapes, the framing and reframing. We have natural scientists who've been using GIS and remote sensing data analysis, combined with participatory mapping to understand what's happening along the coast, especially in Kutch. As I said, visual approaches, which have really helped in bringing local perspectives. And finally, all this is the kind of co-production that we're doing. It's not just about bringing different actors, but as I said, really challenging dominant framings in the way these landscapes and their peoples have been conceptualized. So we'd like to think the project is transformative in addressing epistemic, environmental, and social and gender justice, and also focusing on the root causes of vulnerability arising from climate change, but also other processes of neoliberal trajectories, industrialization, etc. And we're not just researching change, but we'd like to see ourselves as part of the change. So this is transdisciplinary as well as interdisciplinary methods of engagement. And the aim is to also see if through this kind of engagement, we can forge alternative livelihoods through these kinds of alliances. So as I said, it's normative. Obviously, when you're being normative, there's a real focus on the interests of marginalized communities. We're very aware that these are very heterogeneous communities that are shaped by power, class, gender, tribe, caste, and religion. Our focus is on deliberate versus emergent change. And obviously, we have to be vigilant about the risks and dark sides of transformation. So these include the fact that transformation can be used as a buzzword, it's apolitical, it's seen as universally beneficial as opposed to really acknowledging some of the messy and fraught nature of the process. And also the fact that it's inherently political. So really being vigilant about asymmetries in power and gender relations. Also about who wins, who loses, who is agency, who decides, and also these wider issues of co-option, and also being aware that bottom-up change obviously is shaped by and could be hindered by a wider political economy through macro processes. Okay, so now I'll focus on the different sites, and you just tell me, I suppose I'm okay for time. So now this is Kutch. Shilpi's here actually, who's been leading the work, and here are the other colleagues who've been working on Kutch, and we're working with the NGO Sajivan as well as the Camel Breeders Association. So as I said, this was initially a remote backwater when I went. Nobody really went there, very few outsiders, but of course it's been transformed massively since the 2001 earthquake. It's an amazing region, socially and culturally diverse, very syncretic, and ecologically very dynamic. So it's got the Asia's largest grasslands, it's got coast, it's got arid deserts, etc. So there's been rapid industrialization after the earthquake, and the coastline has completely been transformed by the Adanis, the Ambanis, destroying the mangroves and not really being taken into account at all. So large tracts have been disturbed. So actually local fishers, farmers, pastoralists really lack access now to the mangroves. And the mangroves are the main source of fodder for pastoralists living along the coastal belt, especially for these amazing creatures, the wonderful swimming camels of Kutch, the Karai camel. They've recently been declared a species, and there's a huge emphasis on preserving them, but it's very difficult simply because of the way the coastline has been altered, and there's been a huge dispossession of fishers, pastoralists, farmers from their resources. And these swimming camels need to swim out to the mangroves, but it's very difficult for a whole host of reasons. And there were very few of them, but the group we're working with is really trying to revive them, and as well as to make sure that try and help pastoralists to go back to breeding camels. So this has meant exploring different alternative forms of livelihood. Now, these Karai camels are critical to the identity of Kutch, both of the Jats, who you see here in these pictures, some of them, and the Rabaris. The way in this project focusing on the Jat community, and there's synergistic links between the mangroves, livestock, and the pastoralists. So a lot of the scientists vilify them and say that they are destroying the mangroves and actually turning a blind eye to the rapid devastation due to industrialization. And a lot of the scientists actually are working at the behest of the government and the industry, and doing a lot of the environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment. So you really need to study the science policy process. And of course, we're looking also at gendered and intergenerational perspectives. So what's happened is that the camel milk is now being marketed. It's supposed to be very, very good for one's health. And so you have Amul and all sorts of other actors coming in and marketing this camel milk. And we're studying the process. What is actually happening? Is it enhancing the well-being and identity? What does it mean for their livelihoods? What does it mean for culture and economy? We haven't been able to do very much field work, but some of it has started. And of course, a lot of the camel milk production was also suspended due to COVID-19. But a colleague is now back there trying to see what's happening. But before the pandemic, we had lots of interesting meetings. We tried to understand perspectives from the pastoralists. As you see, a lot of the ones who talk are usually men, and the women are often in the background doing the care economy. But obviously, we had a lot of eloquent statements from them about how critical the camels were. Our animals are a lifeline. If our animals flourish, our lives will also flourish. And we've used a lot of mixed methods to try and understand what's going on. So there's been lots of interesting action going on in the district. There's been resistance, alliances, as well as bottom-up transformations. So sort of concerted action by civil society organizations contesting dominant science. There's new alternative narratives and practices emerging. For example, the drylands are not wastelands. They really need to be seen as savanna. We're working with natural scientists from Kyoto University to actually map some of the routes to try and understand what is happening to these mangroves, to push back against some of the dominant scientific framings. There's also been litigation and action against the corporates with some varying success. Good success with the National Green Tribunal. Adani's, unfortunately, did not get penalized by the Supreme Court. And as I said, we've been using GIS, remote sensing, participatory mapping to bring in local perspectives in challenging some of these dominant framings. So it's an ongoing story, and we're trying to understand with this mainstreaming of the milk initiative, what happens. So obviously there are issues of demand and supply in terms of milk. Often the milk, they can't produce the milk. There's issues of marketing, there's issues of production. Also, we need to look at invisible, informal labor provided by women and others. The intergenerational perspectives on identity. Not everybody wants to be a pastoralist, and the trickiness of that. And also the trade-offs and contradictions, also, with some benefiting, others not, and what all this means for environmental sustainability. So as I said, because of the pandemic, it's been difficult to dig deep, but I hope we will be able to finally, now that things are getting easier, pursue some of these issues. So now I turn to the second patch, which is where I'm now, Bombay, and the whole issue about cities as major sites of climate change use, emission, but also coastal cities like Bombay and the vulnerability to climate change. And also we're talking about huge inequalities, injustices, and very unequal expressions of citizenship. So the maximum city, largest and densely populated city, very flood prone, highly vulnerable to climatic changes. But our focus is on coolies, the traditional fishing folk living in these fishing villages. And even though they're the original dwellers of the city, they are the very disenfranchised and really don't have a say, and all the commercial expansion and developments, including the coastal road, are really undermining the livelihoods. So long history, distinct culture, and we've been going to one Kolivada in particular, Vasova, which is a fishing village characterized by heterogeneity, and these coastal spaces are increasingly being contested. So there's encroachment of mangroves, as well as a lot of pollution, plastic pollution, waste being dumped. So here you see, this is the very lively fishing village, but the creek has really been completely decimated by pollution, plastic pollution. So very, very difficult for the fishers to sustain their lifestyle. Also, obviously, climate change, increasing cyclones here in the Arabian Sea. And all these have led to uncertainties in fishing as a livelihood. This happened, we were here yesterday. That was great to go to Koliwada, and our colleagues, Bombay 61, have been doing this placemaking, really trying to revive some of these spaces. And here is a very dynamic fisher who told us about her experiences in lockdown and what happened, how difficult it was, how fishing was stopped, how they actually got very little support from the state, and how it was through horizontal solidarities that they actually managed. And so what's happening in Mumbai is sort of with Bombay 61, our partners, reimagining urban planning. The coolies are really resisting commercial development as well as the encroachment of the coast that are critical for their livelihood and well-being. And obviously these are also communities that are very heterogeneous. There's inequalities around class, caste, and migration, and boat ownership. So now a lot of migrants have come in. There's a whole issue of who owns the boat and not, who has access to the big fish or not, who can actually go to the deep sea, who stays near the shore. And obviously there's all these impacts of urbanization. And so our colleagues, Bombay 61, are looking at several options. They're urban planners. And so this was a workshop when it was all possible, looking at different options that the coolies together with Bombay 61 would do. So for example, creek cleaning, net filter systems, or a sort of participatory form of planning of the creek with the help of the community experts and governments. So these were some of the options that are going to be explored. And I hope now moving forward, there will be a possibility to do some of this in the year that we have left. And this was a wonderful seafood festival, and this was a booth that we had just a month before everything changed and the world changed. But it was really great. I'm not sure whether they'll be allowed to have a seafood festival again, but it was an amazing experience where where our colleagues here were trying to get perspectives from the public and from coolies about, facilitating a dialogue about the creek. Now I'll move to the Sundarbans. I'm giving you a whistle-stop tour. This is the first time I've done something like this, but you gave me a lot of time, 40 to 50 minutes. So I have another 15 minutes, right, Rahul? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, okay, great. So, so now this is Sundarbans, which is the wetland. So we move from dry land to the coast, urban coast, and now the Sundarbans, and very happy to be working with amazing colleagues in India and Bangladesh, and their names are there, Upashana Ghosh, Mahmuda, and others. So as you know, the Sundarbans is the world's largest mangrove delta and it's divided between India and Bangladesh. It's a climate hotspot. And these islands have only been inhabited by about 300 years, but different groups, and they've got incredible history, if you've read Amitav Ghosh's novel. But somehow these different groups of Muslims, Hindus, tribals have created a syncretic culture typical to the islands, where, for example, goddess Bon Bibi is venerated. And, uncertainty is part of the life here, but, there are limits also to uncertainty and precarity. Due to the colonial hangover, these areas have been marginalized. In the Indian context, it's only 100 kilometers from Calcutta, but you would think it was 1,000 kilometers just in terms of the inaccessibility, the problems with the road, the lack of resources and services that these islanders have. And of course, we're talking about very vulnerable communities who are really resilient. And we're trying to do it, but there are also limits to resilience and coping, and we can't really glorify that too. And in recent decades, there's been increasing storm surges, cyclones, land erosion, sea level rise, disappearing islands, but also islands that appear, because there's a lot of things happening in this delta. So we're trying to look at it in a transboundary way, simply because, the political boundary between India and Bangladesh matters for India and Bangladesh, but it doesn't matter for the people and it's a porous border. And it's inhabited by both rural and urban populations. In India, in Bangladesh, it's a reserve forest. So the population lives outside, and there's a 10-kilometer buffer zone. But in India, actually, people live within the Sundarbans too, in the so-called forest area. And there's both urban as well as rural populations. And Camilla, I'm sure, will be able to tell us more too, and whoever else is here. So as I said, it's a climate hotspot. There's a lot going on in terms of climate change, sea level rise in temperature, etc. The Bay of Bengal and the rise in temperature. But there's all sorts of contestations around causality, because it's a dynamic delta. Major rivers drain here. So there's a lot going on, even geomorphologically. So it's difficult to say whether everything is because of climate change. And, there are river ecologists who would say actually it's because of a dynamic river, not necessarily because of climate change. So climate change also interacts with other changes. So the port development, drainage, damming, lots of debates around the embankments. This is a breached one. Should they be concrete? Should they be not? What should you do? Clearly, Bangladesh is doing better than India. Bangladesh has a far better approach to adaptation. India is far more top-down in how it addresses climate change, including in the Sundarbans. So here are some quotes from the Indian Sundarbans. The fact that they actually live under 4 feet of water every day during high tide, and they're used to this. And, the flood comes and goes and what it does. But of course, despite the fact that people are used to these precarities, there is this kind of radical uncertainty that has now increased because of climate change, making things very complicated. And here, Upashana Ghosh and Mahmouda Mitti have been, looking at livelihood changes and what it means. So people have shifted gradually from fishing and agriculture to prawn seed cultivation to beetle lead and sort of also distress, and finally crab catching, distress migration. So there's just sort of shrinking of livelihood opportunities and a diversification, but it's almost like distress diversification. And in the Bangladesh Sundarbans, our colleagues have been examining, the differences between poorer households that are dependent on the Sundarbans versus the more better off ones. And, the landless ones are really, really the ones that are caught and are much more dependent on the Sundarbans for their livelihood. And these are some of the poorest villages, for example, in Bangladesh, with 42% living below the poverty line. And they're very limited non-forest forms of income. It's, of course, the forest department doesn't allow people to go in, etc. And dependency. And a lot of people don't want their kids to be doing this. They don't really want to live here. And it's not an identity that they're keen to pass on. And so, for example, Bon Bibi, who is venerated by everybody there, colleagues are saying that in some ways the influence is going down. There's an increasing influence of mainstream Hinduism, Islam, which is reducing the kind of syncretic culture. People are out migrating. So that has kind of changed the culture and identity also amongst the islanders. So we've been looking at these different initiatives, saline risk. We're working with Caritas in both countries and with LRM and local NGOs who are based there, and exploring different options, saline resistant crops, looking at prawn cultivation, different types of, and this geoponics, sort of water farming. So these are alliances between local NGOs and other stakeholders, and we're just looking at what is actually happening. Many of these are based on local indigenous knowledges and practices. There's an attempt to be gender inclusive within the patriarchal context of both the countries. And of course, you know, there's all sorts of questions about trade-offs around caste, class, gender, sustainability. But, you know, there is an attempt to move from community-based to community-led. And even, you know, but still there are some issues. Many of these lack community voices in planning. The community lacks the knowledge often because it's very focused on day-to-day uncertainties. They could be even quite top-down, even though they're executed by NGOs, even though they aim to be participatory. So there's a lot of challenges, but there is interesting things that we are looking at and investigating. And what's very exciting in the project is really the transboundary learning, because not much has really happened. And in the pandemic, we've actually been able to have a lot of these events digitally and get people together to really push for looking at the Sundarbans as a sort of unified ecosystem with shared culture, ecology, and try and transcend some of the political boundaries, and also the need for shared institutional arrangements and the need to incorporate various embedded stakeholders. So not just sort of para-diplomacy, you know, really learning and sharing amongst communities and between communities, not just at the very national level. So very briefly, I'll just tell you a little about some of the visual methods we've been trying to draw on, especially in the pandemic. We've had to go digital. So some of these visual approaches have really helped focus on bottom-up perspectives, try and tease out people who lack voice, who wouldn't be able to speak out in a big meeting. And this has been led by Shivaji Bose, Anandita Saha, Nathan Oxley, but all the other researchers whose names are here have also been using this work in the patches. So obviously photo voice is something we've been using for a long time. Different stories are told, and every photo voice project is different. And usually we've been working with women and youths because they're not the ones that often show up at the meetings. And then the photographs and narratives are discussed in group sessions. And then we create the photo story. This is really exciting work that our colleague Anandita Saha has been doing. She's connected with different schools in the Sundarbans, even during lockdown. And they were closed, but with the teachers and the students, they voiced their experiences on living with climate change and its impacts. And we're going to do an exhibition with some of this artwork because children have often been the invisible face of climate change, but also the pandemic. You know, in India, children have been out of school for 19 months. And so she's done this work during the pandemic, and there are some very beautiful illustrations from the children highlighting their own perspectives of climate change and uncertainty. And then this triangulation of maps, GIS, pictures, and narratives. We're again working with that, looking at natural science, but also archival maps, and also the participatory maps to try and see, you know, what we can come up with and how we can push back against some of the dominant scientific framings or framings of policy makers. But of course, you know, here also there's politics, there's reflexivity to look at the positionality and reflexibility of the researcher, know that, you know, even GIS and all these scientific methods are not neutral. There's a whole question of access, who has access, etc. And finally, the roundtable is also something that we did in person, but we've been doing that digitally. So here it's sort of looking at translating across different stakeholders, bringing together different hybrid knowledges and perspectives, and trying to bridge gaps between science and policy. So really seeking out multiple perspectives. And this we've managed to do successfully digitally also in the pandemic. So I'm coming to the end now. I think I have another 5 minutes or so. So a lot of the climate change policies, the whole focus on the intended nationally determined contributions, the INDCs, have tended to focus, in the Indian context especially, much more on so-called green economy, net zero, mitigation. And these have ignored bottom-up perspectives, issues of equity, redistribution, as well as local livelihoods. And there's been a lot of greenwashing, a lot of big business interests have been promoted. In Kutch, the wind power has really dispossessed local farmers and pastoralists. And so a lot of our initiatives have been linked to strengthening local livelihoods and really trying to address existing vulnerabilities as well as the lack of power and control over assets. It's important to bear in mind that climate change is one of the many aspects causing poverty and vulnerability. So there are issues of attribution, and climate change intersects with all kinds of things. So for local people, it's very difficult for them to isolate climate change from everything else that is affecting them. Obviously, there are dangers of maladaptation. So you can adapt livelihoods at the expense of others, and these can increase vulnerabilities. We saw that with shrimp cultivation, for example, in Bangladesh. And the governments have largely tended to ignore local